Testing 1, 2, 3. Let's have a prayer. Gracious and loving God, thank you for an opportunity to study your word together, to learn together, but I also pray that we live these stories, that your Holy Spirit continues to move in our lives, that we find ourselves in these people whom we meet. And now I pray for this class in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, somebody in the back, do me a favor and close those glass doors, not to ban people from Sunday school, but that'll just help with noise. That'll help with sound a little bit. Well, welcome to this is the final class of this fall season of Living Water, although we will pick it back up after the new year. We're going to continue the theme. I have been asking you to send me stories about water, and you've been doing it. People have been finding a lot of water in Isaiah. Remember that in the world of Jesus, they lived in a water-stressed place, so that water can become a backdrop for just about every Bible story. I mean, they thought about it all the time. They worried about it all the time. Water becomes power. Water becomes politics. And you're going to see water in a really cool way today as we talk about Samaritans. So the title of this class, and if you want to download the podcast tomorrow, is called Samaritans Are Still a Thing. So there you go. I'm going to tell you more than you ever want to know about Samaritans, but it has everything to do with water and how they worship. So to understand the world of Jesus, we must remember that worship happened in Jerusalem. Now, study and prayer might happen in the synagogue in your village, but worship happened in Jerusalem, and worship was offered to people 3 times a year. They had a festival of Passover, which is a harvest. They're all harvest festivals. Festival of Passover, festival called Pentecost, which means 50 days after, and then a festival called Sukkot in the fall. Those were 3 opportunities. And so if a Hebrew living in the world of Jesus, for instance, in the Galilee, you would try very, very hard to be in Jerusalem for at least one of these festivals for the entirety of your lives, which means that it was a 5 days walk. Just to give you some distance here, by the way, behind me, this slide is a 1/10 scale or so model of the temple, Herod's temple in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus. It was a wonder of the ancient world, and you would walk 5 days to get there, which is roughly the distance of Birmingham to, say, Montgomery. So that's what you would do. You'd hoof it down there. The population of Jerusalem would swell. It would start out, say, around 35,000 people. It would swell to 1 million. I'm certain that the Romans occupying Judea at the time thought this was the craziest religion they'd ever seen in the world. All this movement, if you will, to the capital city for the sacrifices and for the worship of God. Now, incidentally, we do the same thing today as Christian people, as liturgical Christian people. We have 2 halves of our worship. We have synagogue worship and temple worship. If you think about what we do at St. Luke's, we come into church and we read lessons and we think about God, and we might hear a sermon that explains about God, and then the movement happens around the table where we come and we worship God. So we're heirs of this form of worship, if you will. We continue it in that way. We call Jesus the last sacrifice, if you will. Christ, our Passover, is sacrificed for us. So we do the same thing, just without the walk-in and the movement. But the Bible doesn't tell us this part. So we know that part. The Bible doesn't tell us this part. Much of the world of Jesus happens in the lowest place on planet Earth. And this is very, very important because there's very little water. Now, I know I have a little... my visual aids are kind of pitiful today, but that's okay. I'm going to ask you to use your imagination. I'm going to show you a map on a screen in just a minute. But I want you to imagine the Sea of Galilee, which is this little blip right here, this little bubble right here. This is the Sea of Galilee. It's 7 miles wide and 11 miles long. It's the lowest freshwater lake on Earth. It's all part of the Great Rift Valley, which is a crack in the earth that separates 2 tectonic plates, Asia and Africa, begins somewhere in Ethiopia, ends about Damascus, and it is literally a crack. And so you're 800 feet below sea level here. But as Jesus would leave Capernaum to go down to Jerusalem, and he would follow the eastern shore of the Jordan, probably in what is today the nation of Jordan, but he would follow very closely to the river for 5 days until you get to almost the Dead Sea, and then you'd hang a right at Jericho, and you would climb three, maybe almost 4,000 feet. So imagine, for those of you who like to go to the mountains of North Carolina, that drive up the highlands, right, from Georgia, when you just kind of that kind of elevation, except you're starting so low, at 1,400 feet below sea level, that the road looks like this. This is the Jericho Road, for which my Sunday school class is named, and it is as hot as it looks, and it is as dry as it looks. It is a place with no water. So for 5 days, you would travel to worship in Jerusalem in a moonscape that looks like this. By the way, friends, this is the wilderness of Judea. This is the place where Jesus went to be tempted of the devil. This is a place with no water. So remember, we're looking for water stories and how water might show us how things happen, how things work. So it's hot and it's dangerous. You can only be out there for a little bit of time. The sun is really, really strong, and you must stay close to the Jordan River and carry water when you go up the Jericho Road, or you'll die. This is just what it is. So this pilgrimage involves risk. This worship of God involves a little bit of risk. Now, I'll show you a better map than what I've drawn. This gives you an idea of the Jordan Rift Valley. The Dead Sea is at the bottom, and you see the cracks, so it sort of looks like a topo map. You see how it kind of goes down. The Jordan River is the very bottom of the valley up to the Sea of Galilee. You see how green it is where the tribe of Manasseh had their land there on the western shore of the Jordan River. By the way, where it says Manasseh today, that is the current occupied West Bank that you hear so much about with the settlers and the strife that's going on in Israel today, the controversy around the two-state solution and all that stuff. The Palestinian Authority runs several towns in that area, and then the settlers, they're all kind of jockeying for land and position. Just when you read the newspaper now, you can read this with a little bit of informed geography, if you will. But in Jesus' day, it was no less contentious. You see, there's more than one way to get to Jerusalem. So what he would do is he would walk 5 days down the Jordan Rift Valley, and then when they got to Jericho, where it says Benjamin, right there, the little red Benjamin, they'd take a right and they would climb, and then Jerusalem would be in the hill country there in the top. Really, really hard to do. You could just go straight down through Manasseh. You could go down through the green, if you will, because that's on the top of the Rift Valley. That's up several thousand feet above sea level. You get temperate breezes. You've got water. You've got springs, you've got olive groves. It's a pretty nice place to be. In other words, it has more of a Mediterranean, if you will, climate and land. So why did Jesus walk 5 days down in the hottest place on planet Earth, full of danger and no water? Well, that's because Samaritans lived in the pretty part, and Samaritans were the enemy. So now let's talk about what we know about Samaritans this morning and why they were. There was a very recent discovery in Turkey, and it happened really over the last few months, if you will. And someone sent me a photograph of it, just absolutely thrilling. It was a discovery of a relief. Now this would have been far north of here, but in a place that was controlled by the Assyrian Empire. It's a relief from 800 BC, and what they were excited about is they were featuring Assyrian gods with Aramean features, meaning they were Assyrian gods with local features, which means that this is evidence of what we think that the Mesopotamian empires like to do, which was to gobble people up and gobble up their cultures and create kind of a one world order. Let's remember what we've learned so far with Living Water this fall. God's people lived between two superpowers that had a lot of water. Mesopotamia means between the rivers. Egypt had the Nile. This abundance of water gave them stability, it gave them long dynasties, and in time would provide them with very large armies. They were the world's superpowers, if you will. And Egypt also liked to do this kind of thing. The Philistines adopted many Egyptian cultures, and you can find Egyptian-style sarcophagi and reliefs and all that stuff. The Egyptians liked to exert their influence from the south as best they could, but the Mesopotamians were great at it. What they liked to do was obliterate the peoples with whom that they conquered and give them a Mesopotamian identity or Mesopotamian religion. And so what's exciting about this relief is that you've got Assyrian gods now with local faces, which means that they've been adopted, if you will, into the Mesopotamian orbit. Why does this matter? Well, because God's people were asked to be different. Some of you have kind of been with me for a while in this class. I just went gaga a couple summers ago for the Philistines. I was kind of riding around looking for Philistine things, and it occurred to me to ask my archaeology friend, hey, what happened to these guys? You know, they built a lot. They did a lot, and I know that the bad boys of the Bible, but suddenly they disappeared. And my friend Edon said, oh, that's easy. Babylonians, the exile, they disappeared. In other words, I like to say that one of the great backstories of Scripture is the Exodus, which is the escape from Egypt, which only God could do, but then also the exile, which was the event in which the temple was destroyed and they were taken far away from their homes. This was 600 years before Jesus. And yet way out there they discovered that God was God over all, not just over Judea, not just over their local town, but out there with them, talking to them, calling prophets. And so they returned home to rebuild as monotheists, if you will, finally understanding that God was God over all. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So what you've got behind me is a timeline. It's always helpful to have a timeline in your Bible so you can locate things. And so I want to remind you, kind of work down this really quickly, show you how this works. This timeline is a timeline of the Hebrew Scriptures. So 2000 BC is the call of Abraham to leave a city and to follow God wherever God may lead. And God would be in relationship with him, be in covenant with him, and give him everything he ever wanted, which was a kid and land to give it to. And then 1500 years BC, that's the escape from Egypt. So they've a famine, which is precipitated by a drought, has caused them to go to Egypt, the superpower, for relief, and in time they become enslaved people, so only God can rescue them. 1000 BC is King David, who we talked a little bit about this morning in the sermon from William on second Sunday of Advent, the stump from the shoot of Jesse coming out of the Davidic monarchy, which begins 1000 BC. But sadly, people being people, by the time you get to 900 BC, which is 100 years later, God's people have divided into two entities, two warring factions, if you will. We know something about that in our culture as people rub up against each other. And so you had a nation called Israel in the north, and this is where the Old Testament gets a little confusing because sometimes you hear about Israel, sometimes you hear about Judah. They're different. Israel in the north with 10 tribes, a large, prosperous country, but without a strong capital city, so it was less stable. It would be the first to fall. Judah in the south with the capital Jerusalem, but much smaller. So in the year 732 on your timeline, the Assyrians wipe Israel off the map, never to be seen again. Except the Samaritans would say, it's us. We're still here. The Samaritans would say, we're still Manasseh. We're still Zebulun. We're still Issachar. We're still Naphtali. We're still Asher. We're still here. The tribes in the north. The Syrians came through, but we're still the nation of Israel. That's what they would say. Scriptures say otherwise. Now, I'll pause for a second and tell you that Samaritans, as best I understand it, only read the first 5 books of the Torah. They only read the authoritative books of Moses, and you could say that they do that for a couple reasons. One, they've just decided that that's got everything in it. That's all the Bible that they need. But I think another practical or political reason why they don't read anything else in the Hebrew Scriptures is because other writings say this, and this is from 2 Kings. This is the origin of the Samaritans according to the second book of Kings. This is 2 Kings 17, 24 through 28. Okay. The king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, Sepharvaim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria in place of the people of Israel. Remember what we're learning? They like to mix people up and make kind of one alphabet soup of a nation. They took possession of Samaria and they settled in its cities. And when they first settled there, they did not worship the Lord. Therefore the Lord sent lions among them, which killed some of them. So the king of Assyria was told, the nations that you've carried away and placed in the cities of Samaria do not know the law of the God of the land. Notice it's a little g God because they're monolatristic at best, which means that they acknowledge that there are many, many gods out there. You're just going to try to pick the one that you to root for. And therefore he sent lions among them. They're killing them because they do not know the law of the God of the land. Then the king of Assyria commanded, send there one of the priests whom you carried away from there. Let him go and live there and teach them the law of the God of the land. So one of the priests whom they'd carried away from Samaria came and lived in Bethel, and he taught them how they should worship the Lord. Okay, so what you've got are people who've been brought in from Babylon and from a bunch of other, ancient places all around the Mesopotamian basin, and they've been settled in what had formerly been Samaria. I'll use my little pitiful map here and show you how this works. The land of the Bible is only about 120 miles long. That's why it's fun to go there, because you can see a bunch of stuff fast. You don't have to travel great distances to see a whole lot of stuff. I mean, every day you're just like, right, oh, that happened there, that happened there. So 120 miles. Basically, if you start at Beersheba, which is at the bottom beginning of the Negev Desert, all the way up to Dan, which is in the north on the Lebanese border, that's 120 miles. And you've got Judea in the south, Galilee in the north, and Samaria in the middle. So the Samaritan lands, Samaria, is a pretty big chunk of land, and it's got a lot of people living in it. Okay, here's the drama. Remember, we got our timeline. 732 BC, Israel disappears forever. They're blown away. In 586 BC, the Hebrews were exiled. So the same thing would happen to them by the ascendant Mesopotamian Empire, which would be Babylon at this time, Assyria before. But they kept their identity. They didn't blend. Now, I want to say, kind of step back for a second and say, why is that so important? Well, I think that if the Hebrew Scriptures teach us anything, is that again and again and again, it's an answer to an eternal question. Will you be different in the way that I ask you to be different? The reason why you don't rub up against your neighbors, and the reason why you don't take on foreign gods, and the reason why you shouldn't marry foreign people is because you take on their ethics. Ahab was considered a great king of Israel on paper. He was a warrior, he was an administrator, he had foreign trade, he did a great job. He just married a Phoenician princess, and so by which Jezebel is considered wicked because she didn't have their ethics. So one day Ahab took a man's vineyard and Jezebel had him killed, and he should be able to do that by rights as a king, right? Kings can take whatever they want, except not Hebrew kings. Hebrew kings live under the same 10 laws that God gave his people, 10 precepts, 10 ends for creation. The first 4, union with God. The last 6, union with other people. And these are guardrails, and they're for all. And, we might even say that the very foundation of our rule of law happened in this place with those 10 ends. We are who we are as American people because of what was given to this chosen people who were asked to be different in this way. So what do? 600 years before Jesus, they stick together. They don't blend. They keep their distinct identity, and they work hard. I like to say, think about the stories that you know. When things get hard, people get busy. I like to say that St. Luke's story, I've been with you almost 20 years now, has been punctuated by crises that cause us to get busy. I remember the storms of 2011. St. Luke's became the outreach juggernaut that we've always been from a distance, but we suddenly became an insight juggernaut by this. And what I mean is that we've always been an outreach church, but when the storms of 2011 blew away Pratt City, we became a toilet paper dispensary. Do y'all remember those days? Our beautiful parlor suddenly was packed with Charmin from floor to ceiling. And we had a wedding coming up that weekend. I thought, oh, Lord, our church is full of toilet paper. We have a wedding. But the bride didn't care because we were all in a mood to take care of our neighbors, right? We were all in crisis mode. We were all in a new place because when bad things happen, people get busy. And then the story continues again and again. The dispensers of antibacterial, you remember where that came from? Swine flu, 2009. and it just, I could tell you how crises would change how we adjusted or how we reacted to things. Then in 2018, many of you in this room participated in a very generous capital campaign in which we redid the wiring in the building, and we upgraded our technology. We built a beautiful studio. We redid the kitchen, and then we built a basketball court out back that I could not make a really strong case of why we needed it, except I thought it would be cool to hear basketball squeaking out behind the church. Then who knew that all the things that we built would be the things to get us through the pandemic disruption, right? I mean, when things get hard, people get busy. I will say that I was talking to a church consultant the other day. People are fascinated by St. Luke's because we seem to be bucking trends. We seem to be growing, and we seem to be busy, and we seem to be happy, and that's just not a given in this post-pandemic disruption world. And so people have asked me what happened, and I think we're beginning to conclude that while the pandemic disruption was absolute hell on many of you, we've lost loved ones, we must always be solemn about what we've been through. But it was also an invigorating time where we found new ways to be church together. Some of you found us outside. Some of you joined us while we were in our exile out under the pavilion. Nobody was happier than me to go back inside. That was the coldest winter I ever remember. Right? I called it Christmas at Valley Forge. But But we grew, and we found new ways to be church for each other. We just didn't stop. We were a radio station. Now we are a restaurant, which is just fascinates me how all these things we just live into, we take advantage of. These didn't exist 3 years ago, right? So when things are lost, God's people get busy. So I like to say that ours is an exile story as we now stand blinking in the sunlight of Jerusalem again, and we're building a new church together. After 70 years of exile, God's people returned to Jerusalem. Israel may have disappeared forever, but Judah made it. Judah made it. They returned to Jerusalem, and the Samaritans offered to join in. This is a story you can find in the Bible. In other words, they're rebuilding the temple. They're rebuilding what had been lost. And so the Samaritans show up and they say, hello, we're Israel. We're your family. Let's join. Now, I want to read to you Ezra chapter 4. This is a low point in Samaritan-Hebrew relations. And so here we go. When the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the returned exiles were building a temple to the Lord, the God of Israel, they opposed Zerubbabel and the heads of the families. Okay, this sounds a little like The Sopranos to me. Goodfellas maybe. Okay, so they've got heads of the families in Judah. Well, we've got heads of the families in St. Luke's. Okay, so they approached Zerubbabel and the heads of the families and said to them, let us build with you, for we worship your God as you do. Remember, they were taught by, and the Syrian king sent a God over there to teach them how to worship. They're Hebrews, right? Let us build with you, for we worship your God as you do. We've been sacrificing to him ever since the days of King Esarhaddon of Assyria, who brought us here. Zerubbabel, Yeshua, the rest of the heads of the families of Israel said to them, you shall have no part with us in building a house to our God, but we alone will build to the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus of Persia has commanded us. And then the people of the land discouraged the people of Judah and made them afraid to build. There you go. And thus begins 4 centuries of bad family. Ain't no fight like a family fight, right? Bad neighbors in bad lands, and 4 centuries of pilgrims who have to walk down from Galilee down in the wilderness of Judea because they want to avoid them. In turn, or as a result of Ezra chapter 4, the Samaritans, I got a picture of it, the Samaritans would build this. They would build a copy-paste temple on Mount Gerizim, which is here on my little map, right here in the smack middle of Samaria. There are 2 mountains, Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. Joshua, in Joshua 24, back when this all belonged to the Promised Land, Joshua would stand here and he said that Ebal represented curses, Gerizim represented blessings. God's people would be different. They didn't need to build pyramids like the Egyptians would do. They would just use the land around them, let the land tell the story. So these 2 mountains would forever represent a choice. In Joshua 24, he would say, choose you this day. And as for me and my family, I will choose the Lord. And so Mount Gerizim would be a holy mountain. And the Samaritans would say, great, they've got Mount Moriah in Jerusalem. We'll build us one on Mount Gerizim. And my friend Edon worked on that dig during the pandemic disruption. And I've seen it. What's cool about it is that in many ways it is a living display of what life would be in the first century. The building materials, the style. We don't. The temple in Jerusalem, first of all, was covered up by Herod the Great, who turned it into the wonder of the ancient world in a Greek style or Roman style. And so it got covered up, the original second temple, if you will. And then it was all torn down by the Romans. But what we have on Mount Gerizim is something that looks like they would have worshipped. And then even today, there are Samaritans living on this mountain. I'll say some more about that in a second. The reason why, to recap, why Jesus and his friends walked down the Jordan Rift Valley is they didn't want to walk by this. Oh, they would be taunted. They might have even been harassed. I mean, the Samaritans would call out, why are you walking all the way to Jerusalem when we've got a temple right here? Right? It's like stop here. It is fascinating to me that there are about 800 Samaritans still in the world. Most of them live on Mount Gerizim. They worship at the foot of this temple. They don't worship on the temple itself because a late Roman church was built upon it and defiled it forever. People in the Holy Land, curses matter, blessings matter, curses matter, and things can be rendered unclean. And the presence of this Christian church had rendered this temple surface unclean for them, and yet they still worship at the base, and they still do animal sacrifice. I know, right? And so Edon and I were walking around looking at this literal first century structure with these first century people. There are only 800 of them left. A few live in Tel Aviv. Most live on Mount Gerizim. And then I was given an introduction to the high priest of the Samaritans. Okay, actually second in line. He told me that. He said, look, okay, he said, okay, first of all, if you're the high priest of the Samaritans, and there are only 800, there are 3,500 of us here at St. Luke. So I still have a bigger job, all right? Now, even though he's high priest. And so he's the second in line of the high priest. He said, if something, he was quick to tell me, if something happens to my brother, I become high priest. I'm thinking, if I was your brother, I'd be watching that. I mean, he said that a little too often. And also, they don't, I don't think they marry anybody but themselves. I mean, every once in a while, they got to bring in somebody, right? I mean, they got to bring in a mail order bride or something. But it's like, yeah, it's pretty inbred. And for that reason, anyway, Edon will watch this from Jerusalem, and he'll brag me for telling you all this, but they have really long ears, really long. And then you see the children run around, and it's just like, I mean, it's a lesson in diversifying, guys. I'm just telling you, don't do it. But they're really nice, and everybody's got to make a living. They make great tahini up there on Mount Gerizim, and they're trying to get people to come up there and see them, and tell them to come visit the Good Samaritan. Tell them to come visit the Good Samaritan. And I also will tell you, I've had two experiences like this. First of all, I met the second in line to the high priest of the Samaritans. Another time, I was on a hike, and I met the sheik of all the Druze. And I will tell you that when I met both of those men. Well, first of all, when I met the high priest of the Samaritans, or the second in line, his teenage daughter was snoring on a sofa behind him while he was talking. So he bores his family, right? And just like preachers just bore their families to death. I mean, little girl was just going, and so she didn't care she's heard that story before, whatever he was saying. Same time, when I went to see the sheik of all the Druze, what had happened, we had a car left off at the parking lot. And some soldiers were standing around it when we finished a hike, and they said, "What are you doing here?" And Edon, I think, poured it on a little thick and said, "Well, I'm escorting a very important reverend from the United States," which is like total rot. And so the sheik said, "Well, then let's meet him." And they kind of radioed the soldiers. And so there's a lot of sitting down and standing up and drinking, coffee. But I could see that man's eyes were tired. Oh my gosh, I don't think the capital campaign was going well back at the temple, the tomb of Jethro. There was a truckload of Uyghur pilgrims that were just wearing him out. I mean, it was. We all of us in the business have the same problems. I'm just telling you, it doesn't matter what flavor you happen to be. But to this day, there are Samaritans, and now you know something about who these people are in Scripture and why they are the enemy. Isn't it interesting that the first story that Jesus tells in Luke's Gospel after his decision to go to Jerusalem to die is the story of the Good Samaritan. Get it now? The Good Samaritan. In other words, the good enemy. Jesus humanizes, if you will, someone who had been dehumanized by God's people since the return from the exile. We can also, now that you know something about Samaritans and water and their role in it, now you can find deeper meaning in stories that you already know. And I want to try one. Okay, some of y'all got Bibles off the cart. I want y'all to turn with me to John chapter 4, because I don't have a slide for it, but I'm going to read it to you anyways. And if you want to grab a Bible real quickly, it's John chapter 4, and it's on page 864. Okay, so I'm going to read this story because now we know some things, and let's see if we can hear this with meaning. It's John chapter 4, beginning with verse 3. John 4, verse 3, page 864. But Jesus had to go through Samaria. So you know where Samaria is now, right? So he came to the Samaritan city called Sychar, near the plot of ground that Jacob had given his son Joseph. And Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired out by his journey, was sitting by the well. It was about noon. The Samaritan woman came out to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." His disciples had gone to the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria?" Jews do not share things in common with Samaritans. See, we already know all this. And Jesus answered her, "If you know the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' then you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." The reason why I wanted to do this class at the end of this semester is this is where we got the title of the class, Living Water, okay? Sychar is at the foot of Mount Gerizim. So Jesus, in this story, we already know something, right? He's not where he really is supposed to be. He's in this place called Samaria, and he's at the foot of between Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, which is a place you can go today. Jacob's Well is about a half a mile away from the city of Sychar. Now let's think about the details from the story and see if we can find some new meaning. First of all, it's a well. A well is deeper than a spring. In the world of Jesus, the best kind of water would be fresh water, and they called it living water. So that might be a well or a spring or new rain, or the Jordan River. That would be living water. They stored water in cisterns, but that water goes bad pretty quickly. That's the reason why you would drink wine with your meals, because you can't store liquid in a clay jar for very, very long, and it tastes very, very good. But this is well water, which means that it requires drawing from a well, and it requires heavy jars. I read something years ago that makes absolute sense to me, that one of the most important inventions of the 20th century was the washing machine. And that sounds like I'm telling a joke, but it's not a joke, because washing required the drawing of water. And much of half of a day could be spent drawing water and scrubbing and then rinsing and drawing more water, to the point that it was absolutely back-breaking work. I mean, the invention of the washing machine, first of all, saved untold lives of mostly women, but also gave us the possibility of having a concept of the weekend. The washing machine was so important because the drawing of water was such a hard thing to do. Let's think about the story as we read it. The Samaritan woman is drawing water at the noon of the day, which means that she is an outcast. She's drawing water at the noon of the day, half a mile away from Sychar, which also has a water source, which means that she's doubly outcast. She has no friends, and she's walking. And remember, these are heavy jars. So she's got to carry a heavy jar of water for half a mile back to her house. This lady's pitiful. I mean, Jesus has real sympathy for her. True, there are historic boundaries between Samaritans and Hebrews that are documented in the Hebrew Scriptures, and what Jesus sees is a person. Jesus sees a person. Last week in our Bible study, midweek Bible study, we talked about the fact that God is the God of names. God knows names. God knows my name. God has a name. God knows your name. God sees people. We perhaps dehumanize at our worst. We might see crowds or statistics, but God sees individuals, and Jesus sees her, and so he breaks down barriers in order to speak with her. But that's just the start. It all has to do with John's gospel as a whole, which is why I call this class Living Water. The first three gospels, remember how we started this lesson? They would go to Jerusalem to worship. The first three gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, center on the festival of Passover. It becomes the lens or the shape, if you will. Jesus travels to Jerusalem the entirety of his life, but on this last journey, he becomes the Passover lamb. And our communion words are Passover words. So the first three Gospels use Passover, if you will, as a framework for the story. John's Gospel, written later, it's the earliest of the four, more reflective, is different. It's not sequential. It's more like an album, if you will, of a montage of photographs or pictures. It's like a family album, and it's an urban story where the first three Gospels settle in Galilee, the pastoral lands around the sea, Jesus walking on water and fishing and all that stuff. John's Gospel is in the city, and it's on the third festival of Sukkot. And Sukkot is the predominant festival that's talked about. And on the last day of that festival, they would draw water from the pool of Siloam, which was a big wet area that would welcome dusty, hot pilgrims from that nasty, dry road I just showed you, so that they could wash and they could refresh. The priest would take water from the pool of Siloam, and he would climb 300 feet to the Temple Mount and pour water on the altar and pray for rain over the winter so that they wouldn't die. And he calls that water living water. Now I hope you can see John chapter 4, what Jesus is saying to this woman of Samaria at the foot of Mount Gerizim, no less, that living water is busting out all over the place. Not just in Jerusalem, not just in the lives of a brave people who kept their identity in exile, but everywhere and for us. And today, Jesus is here, and he is living water. Well, I hope this gives you a little color and drama of this story swirling around in the Bible that you might never have known otherwise. And Samaritans are still a thing. All right, let me turn this off, and we'll end it, and you can ask me some questions if you want to.